Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning to you, or afternoon or evening as may be the case, and welcome to this session, Space Force and Space Command, Myths, Opportunities, and Technologies. If you have questions for the speakers during this session, please enter them into the chat feature. You may need to scroll right above the video window and click on Track 5 Chat to be able to see that. Now I am pleased to welcome AIAA's Executive Director, Dan Dumbacher.
Well, welcome back everyone to the National Security Space Track. We're particularly excited for this session as its goal is to help dispel the myths and provide the facts about the realities of both the U.S. Space Force and U.S. Space Command. The other key objective of this session is to hear from our panelists on their perspectives of how the Space Force is being designed to take advantage of new technologies and commercial platforms. Those participants speaking with us today are first, John Gaylor, Assistant Vice President, National Security Space, AIA. John is a former active duty Air Force Space Operations Officer, experienced in leading dynamic teams in space operations, strategy, communications, and policy. And it's great to see John again. I first met him when he was on the staff of Senator from my home state. So John, glad you're here. Pam Melroy, who is the owner of Melroy and Hollett Technology Partners, will also be speaking. Colonel Melroy is a retired U.S. Air Force test pilot and former NASA astronaut and Space Shuttle commander. Her experience includes positions with Lockheed Martin, Orion Space Exploration Initiatives, and Deputy Director of the Tactical Technology Office at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. And Pam is a good friend, and thank you, Pam, for being here. And moderating their discussion, we have Mary Cooper, a Brooke Owens Fellow with AIA. Congratulations, Mary. Quite an accomplishment. Mary is a sophomore studying aeronautical and astronautical engineering at Stanford, and we look forward to this. And first, it's my pleasure to welcome John to get the session started. Everyone, please remember to post any questions you have in the chat box below. So John, all yours.
Thanks, Dan. And it's good to see you. It's been a while. It's certainly a little bit different time with getting to see you here virtually. But anyway, I'd like to thank you, AIAA, for the opportunity, and certainly everybody that's tuned in to today's session. So like any good former military member, I've got a couple charts here that I'd like to walk us through and start to have the discussion about Space Force, Space Command, what those myths, opportunities, and challenges are. So roughly 8 months from tomorrow was the anniversary of the signature of the National Defense Authorization Act, enabling the United States Space Force. Next week, we'll celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the stand-up of United States Space Command. And in the last year, a whole lot has happened in the national security space community. So I want to take some time today, explain those roles of those organizations and the opportunities that they've got to reshape the national security space enterprise. So with that, let's go on to the next slide and start talking about how we got here. So first off, why a Space Force? If you followed the debate at all last year or the last few years, it's been many reasons cited: funding prioritization, consolidating authority, acquisition reform, advancing threats. But I'll propose a little bit different reason on why we have it today. I think those are great reasons. I would treat them more as symptoms. And the true cause is that we need a workforce of space-specific experts grown in a mission-focused culture for space. So to get us to that separate service, we as a country and the decision makers here finally recognize two things. And the first is dependence. America is dependent on space for economic prosperity, national security, our everyday way of life. Almost every sector of the economy relies on space: satellite weather data, communications, imagery. Those are things we use every day in our personal and professional lives. GPS gets the most attention because it's the most recognized capability, but it doesn't just get you across town or make sure that your dinner arrives on your doorstep. Its timestamps are used to process every credit card and debit card swipe we make, as well as $5 trillion a day in market transactions. We could literally devote an entire hour or an entire day talking about what space provides to our everyday lives. But the initial intent when we developed space as a country was national security. And space is more important to that than it ever has before. First off, real-time communications are enabled by space, so commanders and troops across the globe can communicate. Space provides eyes and ears to quickly alert our decision makers to emerging threats and place weapons on target with pinpoint accuracy. And it can warn of inbound weapons, so we can maximize our chances of intercepting to protect the homeland or other assets, and provide extra time to seek shelter. We actually saw this live in January when Iran launched a missile attack, striking a US base in Iraq. And the missile warning satellites we have provided enough advanced warning that our troops overseas could take shelter and likely save some lives. So our reliance on space couldn't be clearer. Let's go to the next chart and discuss the other recognition about the space domain that led us to this service. And that's that space is unique. First off, space provides the US an asymmetric capability to assert all instruments of national power. Sometimes we call this DIME, diplomatic, information, military, economic. But we have these instruments of power because of space. And then we can do that without risk to human life. In military operations, we call that a force multiplier, and they can make the other domains so much more effective. But our adversaries that have sat on the sidelines have seen that unique advantage we have and have actively worked to contest it. China and Russia and other adversaries are not only developing capabilities, but they're also developing the military doctrine that show their intent to offset our advantages in space. In recent years, we've seen them test missiles to destroy satellites, closely trail really expensive and exquisite US satellites on orbit, and most recently deployed an unknown projectile from a satellite. Unfortunately, the way we designed the space enterprise, they weren't designed to operate against those threats. So this leaves us nearing an unacceptable outcome, an enemy capable of freely interfering with those unique space capabilities. And also unique is a set of people and technology that's required to outpace those threats. Before Space Force, those people and processes were housed under the Air Force, but they were grown in a different culture, one devoted to a different domain, the air. And they performed admirably. They produced all those capabilities that we've become dependent on for everyday life, for economy, for national security. But it's not enough. We needed a different type of workforce that can be only grown over time and in a very deliberate manner. And that, I submit, is what Space Force is about. Building the unique talent, one that will change how we operate, how we fight, how we develop, how we acquire in an evolving domain. So when we came to recognize the dependence on and the uniqueness of space, it became quite clear that a new service was the only way to effectively meet those needs. And the clock was ticking, because this need isn't driven by us, but by our advancing adversaries. Throughout the debate, and even today, myths of the service and the domain have prevented a fundamental understanding of their importance. Let's talk about some of the most erroneous myths in the next chart. A lot of people think that Space Force is a new concept. Well, frankly, it wasn't. The debate spans back decades and came to focus shortly after the Gulf War, when we started using our space assets differently. See, space was designed in the Cold War era for strategic use, taking photos of Russian nuclear weapons, which actually we just celebrated the 60th anniversary of that yesterday, or communicating with forces that could potentially be under nuclear attack. But we realized in the Gulf War, we could start to use these satellites for tactical purposes, putting bombs on target, battle damage assessment after strikes, navigating a desert terrain that's void of landmarks. After that, space began being woven into every combat plan, and with that became increased calls for focus on the domain and even separation. 2001, Congress mandated the Rumsfeld Commission to study national security space. One of their recommendations, 19 years ago, was to reorganize space under the Air Force with a path forward for a separate service. Now, given the conflict in the Middle East over the past 19 years, that idea lost a bit of support over time, but it was brought back to life in 2017. And that's where another myth comes into play. The Space Force wasn't a bipartisan effort. That's also wrong. So the effort was actually started in 2017 by a bipartisan group of House representatives, Mike Rogers and Jim Cooper, who actually created a Space Corps in the House version of the defense bill. It didn't get through the Senate, but the ball was rolling. And in 2018, President Trump picked up the mantle, calling for a separate Space Force. In 2019, the combined push from the administration and Congress, along with that bipartisan bicameral support, is what got Space Force across the finish line and made it our sixth service. As much as the history and politics are misunderstood, so too is space warfare, and I think we should talk about that on the next slide. Pop culture has certainly raised enthusiasm for the final frontier, but I would argue it's also done a bit of a disservice in that it's fairly inaccurate description of what conflict in space looks like today. Contrary to Star Wars or the Netflix show Space Force that just came out, space warfighting is actually orchestrated on Earth, not on rocket ships, not the moon, not Mars, and most of it's done away from traditional combat zones. missions, where our warfighters are wielding keyboards, not rifles. They speak orbitology and not artillery. So it requires a different kind of warfighter. Now, it certainly requires one that understands the needs of the other military services and the domains in which they fight: land, air, sea, and cyber. But it also requires a warfighter who understands the different technologies, doctrine, and operating concepts needed to protect and defend the space assets that we provide to the Joint Service. Adding to the confusion is the difference between these two organizations, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So what you have here is what space looked like in the Pentagon in 2019, before Space Force and Space Command. So Air Force Space Command was one of 11 major commands, and that was what held the space mission underneath the Chief of Staff of the Air Force as one of these 11 major commands. On the warfighting side, what we call the joint side is a combatant command, and that was U.S. Strategic Command. You can see that on the left side there. So they house the space warfighting mission, but they also do the nuclear deterrence mission. Combatant commands are how we fight wars, not the services. These COCOMs, as they're called, are the warfighting organizations that are charged with particular military operations for regions or global missions, both peacetime and war. And US STRATCOM had the space warfighting and the nuclear deterrence mission. Next chart will show you what it looks like today. So this is the Pentagon, Department of Defense, National Security Space Enterprise today. On the right-hand side, you can see what happened with the Space Force. Air Force Space Command was elevated to its own service, now falling under the Secretary of the Air Force, similar to a Navy Marine model. General Raymond, the Chief of Space Operations, is now peers with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the other service leaders. It's a small service, though. Currently, it's just Air Force personnel. It's roughly 16,000 of them, the third the size of our smallest service, the Coast Guard. What's not in the Space Force is also important, as this was designed to be a very lean organization and be designed over time. So none of the other services are in it. And some of the other services have both personnel and organic space assets. There's currently no Space Reserve or Space National Guard. General Kreider talked about that in the previous session, but we still use the Air Force Reserve and Air Force Guard to augment our space forces. There's also no Space Development Agency, the new organization to rapidly field new space capabilities. Those discussions are ongoing with Congress and the Pentagon. You can expect that some of those will likely move or stand up at certain times, but they're not part of the initial tranche of the Space Force. Additionally, the National Reconnaissance Office, the organization that builds and flies our nation's spy satellites, aren't there either. Back to the joint warfighting side, U.S. Strategic Command handed off the space warfighting mission to U.S. Space Command last summer. And there's typically been a little bit of confusion on what is a service and what is the command. And I think there's some confusion also with the location. We see this reported a lot in the press. I can tell you right now, U.S. Space Force is headquartered in Washington, D.C. in the Pentagon, just like the other services. But there's currently a competition out there for who will host U.S. Space Command headquarters. You can imagine the infrastructure and jobs that come with that. So a lot of cities would love to have that organization come to their location. So there's a lot of news articles, and a lot of them are incorrectly representing Space Force versus Space Command. So I'd like to implore you, if you see an article that says Colorado, Florida, or some other states are competing to host Space Force headquarters, what they mean is Space Command. And so I think that drives a bit of a myth. But more importantly to spell out is what are the missions of these two organizations. So Space Force, like the other services, does what we call organize, train, and equip. I think the easiest way to say that would be that they provide the people and the technology with which the joint services, the combatant commands, fight. Your Space Command employs those forces and technologies for warfighting in, from, and through space. So this means that U.S. Space Command, we use the people that Space Force, as well as other military services, have trained and the systems that they've procured to provide those services to users on Earth. So think GPS, communications, etc. But then also protect those systems from attack in space. But what's really important is what lies ahead. And let's go to the next slide to talk about that. So standing up a new service for the first time in over 70 years, remember that the Air Force was our last service, is an incredible challenge. Toss in advancing adversary threats, and there's really not much room for error. But with this challenge comes opportunity, and I'd say this is truly a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the community. Here's some of the most important challenges that I think can transform into opportunities. First, maintain bipartisan support. Space Force is under an incredible microscope, being a brand new branch. They need support from both sides of the aisle as they stand up and request congressional approval and funding. This is going to require consistent engagement and transparency on both successes and shortcomings. Bottom line, there's no room to fall victim to partisanship with this new organization tasked with so much. They also must become a lean and mission-focused service. Now, lean, mission-focused, they're great buzzwords, but they're really important. Being lean provides an opportunity to move quickly, to fail fast, and to change course when needed. That's something difficult of larger organizations. So having 16,000 people gives you an opportunity to turn the ship very quickly. Being mission-focused allows you to put all that energy towards getting after the threat and nothing else. The service has to challenge all assumptions of what a new service will look like. There just may not be a parallel for space, and that's a good thing. An opportunity to buck some ancient military traditions that maybe don't fit modern warfare or the space domain. This also means consider radical changes, missions, operations, organizational structures, personnel requirements, authorities. There are no sacred cows here. There's been some encouraging results so far. Space Force has trimmed their headquarters staff to roughly 600 compared to thousands of other services. General Kreider mentioned field command stand-ups. That actually eliminates 2 levels of command. So you reduce overhead and you empower your commanders with the authority and better access to top leadership. And the Air Force is going to provide mission support functions for the Space Force rather than growing them organically. Think security forces, think chaplains, think doctors. Those things are not necessarily mission critical for the Space Force. So they can put their energy on the threat and rely on the Air Force for those. Workforce. People are the heartbeat of military service. The main reason for the stand-up of Space Force, the ability to properly recruit, retain, train, and educate this new space cadre will frankly determine success or failure. The workforce will draft the doctrine and warfighting concepts, write the code, test systems, develop, procure, and operate satellites we need. They are the future. 21st century warfare has evolved, and to prevail, we need a diverse force that better reflects America in 2020 and beyond. This means opening the door to broader talent pools, altering an outdated personnel management system, and tuning to the motivational incentives and structures the new workforce needs to pay immediate dividends in shaping this human capital that will fuel the force. And finally, hand in hand with workforce, we need to better leverage technology and innovation. The threat is constantly evolving. I mentioned that Russian satellite. It won't be long before we hear something else. An agile space-focused acquisition system is the only way to keep pace. Space Force will need an enterprise that understands the technologies it needs and how to get them quickly. And this is going to mean breaking down some acquisition system barriers. The system is currently ill-suited for space, and that's something Pam's going to talk about a little bit more in length. But none of these are going to happen overnight. The true yield of the Space Force is not necessarily right now. It's 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, when this next generation of space professionals have grown in the service culture. But the opportunities to build those foundations have to be set quickly, and they need consistent support if the successes will take hold. From daily life to military capabilities, space plays an increasingly important role every day. And it'll be these new organizations, the Space Force and Space Command, that ensure we can outpace those threats and preserve and advance the benefits that space brings to each and every one of us. With that, Dan, let me hand it back over to you.
Thank you, John. I know we're going to have lots of questions, and we look forward to that discussion. Next, we'll hear from Pam Melroy, and then both speakers will join in the question and answer period. So Pam, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Before I go any further, I think this is a great opportunity to dispel one myth. Several people have observed that the shape at the center of the Space Force patch bears a resemblance to the Star Trek Starfleet logo. And I just want to point out that that delta shape, which has also influenced actually the force structure. It's different than the Air Force force structure, and one of the command levels is called deltas. That delta shape, which is sort of a stylized rocket, was actually originated in 1961. So as opposed to Star Trek influencing Space Force, in fact, the heritage of the Space Force influenced Star Trek. So I just wanted to dispel that myth right away. Next slide. Yeah, so John made some great comments about acquisition. You know, I'm going to say that probably the most important acquisition change is just having a Space Force by itself. We have some clues about what the Space Force is thinking about. There's a draft alternative acquisition report that went to Congress that is currently still being reviewed inside the executive branch before being finalized. But the draft made some really, really important points. And if there were two things that were completely obvious, one was speed and the other one was agility. And those are two words that are not usually associated with government acquisition. I had an interesting experience at DARPA where I think we had the opportunity to accomplish both speed and agility. And we did it actually within the confines of the federal acquisition regulations. There's a lot of policies, though, that surround acquisition that they can be restrictive. It's not the actual regulations or the law itself. It's the policies that grow up around them. So it's an extraordinary opportunity with a brand new service to rethink some of those policies. There were points made in this draft report that I think are very important, that do require some, perhaps some statutory changes, just a couple, and then perhaps a few changes in policy inside the Department of Defense. But many of them are provide tremendous opportunities to go faster just by alleviating some of the ways that business is done. And I think that this is so important because as John pointed out, the threat is evolving very rapidly. And so if it's going to take you upwards of 10 years to initiate a new program and execute on it and get something delivered, that's a real problem. The threat has already changed substantially in the last 10 years. And so that agility is really important. Where the flexibility comes in is as you're executing a portfolio of programs, if you have an area that is perhaps experiencing technical problems or schedule difficulties, and another area that perhaps has increased urgency or is going very well, the ability to shift funding between those programs across to basically to maximize and optimize the portfolio is something that is incredibly valuable. Now, it will be interesting to see which of these changes are possible. Congress does not like it when they don't feel that they have transparency and insight. So when things get shifted, they can get some concerns, but that's mostly at the highest visibility programs. So if there's some opportunity to add that kind of flexibility and agility, that's going to make an enormous difference. Next slide. So these proposals also brought out a couple of things. One of them was governance. So currently the Space RCO and Space and Missile Center. So the RCO is the Rapid Capabilities Office. There's an Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office, but there's also a Space Rapid Capabilities Office, and that's coming under the Space Force, as well as the traditional acquisition arm of the Air Force for space, the Space and Missile Systems Center in California. The Space Development Agency is a new agile acquisition organization that currently sits under the Office of Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And the proposals bring the Space Development Agency under the Space Force as well. So sort of consolidating, when I look at this, I see a portfolio approach. You know, Space and Missile Systems Center has the requirements, shall we say, the big programs that you need and the ability to sustain them. The Space RCO is more near-term focused. Let's get new technologies and get them fielded very quickly. And the Space Development Agency has been looking at completely different architectures. And I'll talk about that actually in a few minutes when I talk about technology. So it's a different approach. And then of course, the Air Force Research Lab and DARPA will continue to provide capabilities as well. Cutting red tape. Boy, there's already just a huge step just by the fact that an entire level has been taken out of Space Force when you compare it to the other military services. So a whole level of management. And that has an enormous impact on acquisition, because when you're constantly prepping for reviews at each level, that is a serious problem. But the acquisition goals of the Space Force that have been articulated is basically to push those decisions down to the lowest level possible, remove bureaucracy, and help move faster. And another major underpinning to the acquisition approach for the Space Force is to leverage to the greatest extent possible the growing commercial space industry. This is really quite remarkable. I can tell you that when I went to DARPA in 2013, that was just, there were a few conversations barely beginning, but I think the idea that commercial space would have something to offer to the military services was still actually a fairly substantial question. So to see the Space Force leaning in on this and pushing hard and saying, nope, if we can find it commercially, we're going to use it. It's a big step. Next chart. Another major opportunity is the increasing relationship with our allies and partners. One of the most important relationships in space is what's called the Five Eyes Partnership, and that's the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And that's a very strong partnership. It encompasses the sharing of our most important and sensitive operational and space information. There is an extension of that partnership. It's typically called Five Eyes plus 1, 2, or 3, and that includes France, Germany, and Japan. And there's no question, if you look in most important documents, so if you're interested in learning more about Space Force, I recommend looking at these 3 documents. The first one would be the Defense Space Strategy. So we've had Defense Space Strategies before, but a new one came out in May. This Draft Acquisition Report, which I mentioned as well, that came out in May. And then just last week, I think it was the Capstone Space Power, which is the inaugural space doctrine document. And I know this is kind of hard to believe. It's hard for me to believe as an Air Force pilot, where there's this huge history of doctrine that goes back to World War II. It's really the first space doctrine document. And something that really stands out in all 3 of those documents is the references to the importance of partnerships with our allies. And, space is inherently global, but I think, I think it goes far beyond that. I think we look at some of the challenges. There's important work being done by the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and other forms of diplomacy. Certainly, NASA is a very strong soft diplomacy tool with the International Partnership for the International Space Station. But I think increasingly the world is turning into a multipolar place. And as a result, these alliances take on an outsized importance. And it is very obvious that the Space Force is taking advantage of that and is also pushing in this area. Next slide. So I'll take a moment to talk about technology. The Space Force has issued in their doctrine some of their areas of expertise. They reinforce the fact that access to space is absolutely critical and central to the mission of the Space Force. And so what we're seeing is increased contracting around commercial launch. I have some pictures here. The Space Force hasn't hasn't quite decided to fund suborbital yet, but I think there's a lot of really interesting acquisition activities happening with AFWorks and Space Pitch Day and other really creative opportunities to work with commercial space companies to bring in capabilities and see how they can be used. And I think this is super important for a significant reason, and that is because of the awareness that we have that our satellites are now at risk. John talked about the Russian satellite. We worry about these maneuvering satellites. There have been ASAT tests performed by China and in recent times in India as well. And so the question is, boy, if one of your most important assets got shot down or disabled in some way, what are our opportunities for rapid reconstitution? And I think this is really the fundamental reason why the technology of commercial launch is increasingly important, and the Space Force is emphasizing it. Next slide. Another technology, I mentioned this, the Space Development Agency, SDA, and they have pushed hard on this idea of, instead of monolithic satellites that are a target for an anti-satellite weapon, let's complicate the problem by taking advantage of the fact that with Moore's law, you can pack more capability into a small sat. And if you have large constellations of small sats and are able to put them together in a mesh network, there's a couple of really interesting things that start to happen. First of all, you have ubiquitous sensing. Now, we have pretty good sensing today, but a lot of the systems are oriented from geosynchronous orbit because that's how you have persistence. The orbit is synchronized with the rotation of the Earth, so if you have persistent sensing of a part of the Earth. The problem is that you're pretty far away, 36,000 kilometer high orbit, so you have to have a very large telescope to see that far. The problem with low Earth orbit is you're whizzing past and going round and round the Earth every 90 minutes. And so you don't need a very large telescope to get really good data, but it's gone, it's not persistent. So you can see that these low Earth orbit, or what's called proliferated low Earth orbit, or PLEO satellite constellations, actually solve that problem by having a mesh network. Every part of the Earth will have a low Earth orbit satellite in view that can pass information. It's not restricted by whether it happens to be over a ground site or not. DARPA has also been working on the same idea on a program called Blackjack, and AFRL is also engaged with that. So this idea of looking at these huge satellite constellations, I think, is quite different. I don't think that you should expect to see everything that the Space Force does handed over to these constellations immediately. You'll hear a lot about hybrid architectures, which is, hey, when does it make sense to have the large exquisite satellite, and when does it make sense to have a constellation that provides this ubiquitous sensing? And since companies like SpaceX with their Starlink or OneWeb, or many other companies interested in this, how should the Space Force take advantage? Should they just put a sensor or purchase data from these constellations? Do they use them for networking or communications? And I think we're going to see a lot of clarity on that emerge over the next few years. Next chart, please. Space domain awareness. I just brought up the point about these large proliferated constellations. Well, of course, that makes the issue of looking for collision avoidance or conjunction avoidance even harder. Currently, the Space Force has the statutory responsibility to notify space operators around the world, commercial, other governments, and domestic, if there is a potential collision or conjunction that's coming up. Now, with all these increased amount of satellites, especially in low Earth orbit, that problem has gotten harder and harder. So there have been some new technology investments on the part of the Space Force and the Air Force before, with the Space Surveillance Telescope, existing radars, but also Space Fence coming online. But this is another area where commercial space is playing an increasing role. You have small companies like Leo Labs with their radar capability, and Exoanalytics and others that have optical capabilities. And they're around the globe, so they can amplify and provide more persistent coverage and greater data. When you talk about persistence, I just want to go back to the very first thing that I talked about in acquisition, which is speed. And if there is a single thing I think that defines why changes need to happen, is things are happening very quickly and we're not always in a position to see them or to respond to them. And so space domain awareness is really about seeing it, and the acquisition piece and other technologies is about responding. And this is an area that is going to have significant growth, and I think a significant relationship with commercial going forward. Next chart, please. One of the things that I thought was fascinating about the doctrine document was there was a focus on space mobility and logistics. So there's an old and famous quote from a military general that says, amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. Logistics underpins just about every aspect of defense. And so this is very much of an emerging area in space. Specifically satellite servicing. If you think about it, one of the unique things about the space station is that it's actually possible to upgrade it and repair it. Other than the Hubble Space Telescope, there is no other satellite that's been designed with that in mind. And so that is a huge challenge, leading to what's been called the chicken or the egg problem. Well, I didn't design my satellite to be serviced, so why should I build a servicer, because it wouldn't be able to service it? Well, some really significant advances, particularly in robotics and autonomous rendezvous, have changed the story there. And Northrop Grumman is a leader in this area. They just, I believe, just launched their second mission extension vehicle, which is the capability to attach to an existing satellite and provide propellant for it to stay in space longer. So it's essentially a version of refueling. DARPA's robotic servicing of geosatellites, which Northrop is also a partner on, goes even further for close inspection, repair. About every 3 years, there's a major incident where something goes wrong with a satellite, whether a solar array fails to deploy, or perhaps an antenna fails to deploy. And in some cases, we don't actually know what it is. I mean, you follow all of the fault trees and you try to figure it out. We have some capability now for other satellites to maneuver and take pictures. But if it's broken, you're pretty much stuck. So if you're really interested in space mobility and logistics, this is going to be a critical part. Long term, it will also create the ability to build satellites in space as well. Next slide. I think another area of emphasis in doctrine is about information mobility. So some of the advanced communications, laser communications, or optical comms, as it's sometimes called, quantum encryption. I think another area that's really significant is actually electronically steered arrays that allow you to have sort of a flat panel for communications that is much lighter weight, size, weight, and power being everything in space. So I think these advanced communications technologies are of enormous interest to the Space Force, and they're definitely actively pursuing all of them. Next slide, please. And I think I'd just like to conclude by saying, from my viewpoint, the opportunity of the Space Force is probably what I think is the absolute most exciting thing in the world. And that's a clean sheet of paper to start with in all of these areas going forward. All right, I think we can take some questions now, John, if you're ready.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Those were amazing presentations, John and Pam. I just want to take a moment to thank AIAA for organizing this amazing webinar. But like Pam said, we're going to move on to our Q&A session. A reminder to everyone watching that you can submit questions through the chat. I'll send our first question off to John. I'll give you a moment to breathe, Pam. So John, you talked a lot about Space Force opportunity and honestly necessity to train the way the Pentagon manages human capital. Can you give us some examples of where the service can actually make changes in the way it recruits, retains, trains, and even educates its members?
Yeah, no, great question. Certainly near and dear to my heart. And I think this piggybacks perfect off of Pam's a clean sheet slide. So I think I would look at it from 4 perspectives. I think first off, you need to redefine requirements. What do you need your space warfighter to do? And that should be what defines the entry requirements for the service. This is not a lowering of those standards, but it's taking a look at what traditionally keeps 70% of our population from joining the military, because that's what the stats are right now. Now, not all of them can be moved and not all of them should, but I think over time, as we've seen the military evolve, it's thrived because it's challenged the status quo of those who could swear that oath to protect and defend the Constitution. And so opening the doors to them and, bringing that different, diverse background and skills outweigh, the unchallenged institutional norms. So getting after that, what do you need a space operator, acquirer, intelligence officer, enlisted member to do? And then base your entry requirements on that. I think when you have members in, then you need to consider what motivates them as well. So, this is a new generation of workforce, a new generation of talent, and it's pretty much a fairly archaic personnel management system. So how do you modify these rigid career paths, compensation, impacts on families that these folks use to evaluate their career satisfaction? And do they stay in? Do they leave? I'm talking things like up or out promotion system, portability of status. Let people flow in and out of industry, academia, think tanks, and come back in, because there's going to be value on both ends there. The service will get it from having members that have this outside perspective, and then the outside of the military will get that too. And the last 2 things I'd say is utilize the reserve and guard, and I think you can do that a little bit differently with that portability of status. So when folks do leave, they've kind of got an opportunity there. So rethink what you do with that, and then don't forget about the civilians, because they're just as important. And when I talked about most of the operations are done away from traditional combat zones, this is an opportunity to sit there and look at what roles of the Space Force should be civilian versus military. Key warfighting functions need to stay to uniformed members, but some of these missions are supportive in nature. And how can we, how could you potentially shift that? And then how do you care and feed for the civilians too? Because they're just as valuable a member, and we need to make sure that their system and what keeps them in is just as good as what we do for the military.
Thanks for that, John. Yeah, this is definitely a very exciting time. So our next question for either of you, a lot of our audience members are definitely interested in eventually working with the Space Force. How would you say they go about doing that? And also for people like in my generation in particular, what would you tell them to inspire them to explore careers in space?
Well, I think actually there's a lot of interest. So the Space Force has been sort of taking a tiered approach. It was widely reported that there was a single member of the Space Force for several months, and that was actually General Raymond, the Chief of Space Operations. And I'm happy to say that there's more. There was a group of cadets who graduated and were commissioned from the Academy and went straight into the Space Force. How exciting is that? And recently applications were made open inside the Air Force. I think, from my standpoint, as I look at it, they're going to march out, right? The next step will be looking at people who do space things in other services and letting them apply to transfer, those kinds of things. in addition to that, I think, this civilian piece is going to be incredibly important. So I think you're going to have to be patient, because I think they're going to methodically march their way out. But one thing is very obvious, and John touched on this, which is that they're really looking at unique ways of deciding who's going to join. And I think that whatever they do, it's going to be a whole lot easier than the way it is now to try to sign up for some of the other services. And that's just fantastic. And I do think it's going to be very important also to understand, how you can join as a civilian. One of the things that I've wondered is, will they take advantage of people who are space experts who had a full career like John? Not that I'm recruiting you, John, but take a look at bringing some of those people back to the Space Force in very senior positions, maybe even jumping up a few ranks. So I think, that would be very novel, would be to have somebody coming in at a different rank level and so forth. So I think you're going to have to be patient for now, but I really see some great opportunities.
Yeah, and I'll chime in there. I think certainly leave the inspiration to the astronaut. And certainly, Pam, I think that's great. There are a lot of opportunities, and we'll continue to see more. And I think I would, say that there's a lot of this relies on us, right? This isn't just the services. So we've got AIAA putting on this Ascend event. We've got AIA, where Mary and I work right now, that look at pushing STEM education down to lower levels, getting folks excited early. There's not a better time to be in the space business. I think Memorial Day weekend proved that. And then with everything we've seen on the Space Force side, there's a lot of excitement. And the numbers have shown that a lot of folks want to be a part of that. So, the service, they'll have to decide how they bring those people in and how to get that right mix of talent. But I do think that there's a lot there that we can keep pushing on, that we can start to, energize and get people excited, so that, there's this demand signal of people that are very smart about space, and they're knocking on the door. And Space Force will have this enormous menu of folks to choose from. And it won't just be, hey, my story of how I got into space, I'm a journalism major. And I'm so thankful I got there. But it was just dumb luck, but there should be folks banging on the door, so many qualified applicants to do that. And I think programs like this, Mary, you're a Brooke Owens fellow, right? I mean, things like that. And we should really capitalize on this enthusiasm in space and build up more of those opportunities, more of those programs, so people are connected, people know what these services do, and they can get their foot in the door from there.
Awesome. Yeah, space is definitely a booming industry. I'm very excited to see where it goes. Our next question from the audience specifically asks if the Space Force will take money or funding away from NASA. Could either of you guys elaborate a little more on the relationship between NASA and the Space Force?
Well, I guess I'd go so far as to say there's really no reason why money should be taken away from NASA. I mean, part of it, to be perfectly honest with you, is that the way our congressional budgeting is set up is by committees. And there are defense committees who look very closely at the defense budget. This is actually one of the big challenges for the Space Force, for space before there was a Space Force, because as just a subset of the Air Force budget, the budget priorities always had to be racked and stacked against what the Air Force had from the aviation side, which of course is where the heritage is and where the many of the senior generals are from. So being able to have a separate budget, set your priorities and ask for it is just, it's a major difference. But there are completely different committees that oversee NASA, and that budgeting process is seen very differently. However, there is an important relationship. There's a tremendous operational relationship. Like, for example, if you look in Florida, the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, and Patrick, the huge range facility and the launch facilities. NASA has their own launch facilities, but they use the range. And so that relationship is very, very tight from a security aspect, from consistency in launch procedures and sharing resources like, radars and so forth. So that, that hasn't changed. I think what's interesting though, and we're getting hints of this, and I'm certainly seeing it, there's really a blurring of the lines between commercial, civil, and national security space. They used to be highly siloed from a policy standpoint, from an acquisition standpoint, everything. And, these things are starting to play together in ways that are unexpected. A great example is cislunar. Okay, well, we're maybe a little bit worried. Some people are very worried about China treating the moon the same way they're treating the South China Sea. So that becomes very important for perhaps the Space Force to have better space domain awareness and actually understand what's happening in cislunar space. And there's a real question, is there an obligation on the part of the Space Force to protect commercial and civil assets in cislunar space? So I think I'm seeing hints of it in the doctrine that, there's a sort of a growing appetite for an integrated national space strategy that really looks at all three of those areas. So I think that's a very positive outcome.
Yeah, Pam, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I'll just comment on that last piece. And I think that debate has certainly been amplified. One of the things I've been excited about as we've seen this debate play out is folks are writing, folks are talking. There's more events based on space. Look at this Ascend series, right? This isn't just the November capstone. There's all these. And so you have, these two schools of thought that at one point, so they call the brown water thinkers that see the value of military space power as a function serving, the terrestrial warfighters. And you've got the blue water school of the folks that see that value as a support to expanded commerce in space. And now you're seeing, especially when you look at the doctrine document that just came out, the services are actually starting to think about how do we expand beyond that and not just provide support down to our terrestrial users. It's exciting, and I think certainly you'll see more collaboration and more blurring of those lines between NSS, civil, and commercial moving forward.
Thank you, guys. So Space Force is definitely an up-and-coming branch. It's going to be dealing with a lot of new technology, knowledge, capabilities. And we had a question from the audience asking if you guys could talk a little bit more about the current plans and programs that are either being put in place or already in place to train its officers and enlisted members to make sure that they're properly prepared for what's coming.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump on this one. So currently, when you come into the Space Force, you are going through an initial schoolhouse where you're getting that in-depth education on what space is, how you're going to utilize these tools. So we talk organize, train, and equip. That's the training side, right? So currently, that program has already been beefed up by the Space Force. I think they've started to recognize just how important that foundational education is as you start to look at how the domain is going to change. I can tell you from my time, and certainly with Pam's, just seeing the threat evolve. I came in 2007, and that was the year that China launched their ASAT test and how things change. And so for the academic curriculum to catch up with that takes some time. And so there's certainly needs to be an emphasis up front and how we're going to train those folks. But then on that piece of how do we educate? There's a training up front, but then throughout a member's career, and that's what Space Force has a great opportunity with this clean sheet approach. Do you send them to a school of space policy? Do you send them to an engineering school? Does the service develop something? But that you can leverage all of these different educational mechanisms so that they can be caught up on the threat. So they're bringing that information back to their unit, and they're making the best decisions to bring those technologies to bear.
Awesome. So we have time for one more question. And I think it would be great to end on a note of maybe having both or either of you talk about your time in the military and how you see that has affected your career and why it kind of inspired your career in space and how you think the Space Force will be able to do that for others.
I'll defer to Pam first.
Yeah, well, for never go after the astronaut, John. I just thought I'd tell you that, but that's okay. I actually was very inspired by Apollo. And when you go back to the history of that time, almost all the astronauts, except for my good friend Jack Schmitt, who was the first scientists and only scientists to set foot on the moon. They were all military jet test pilots. So I said, okay, that's what I'm going to go be too. And my father was in the Air Force, so I had a very positive view. He was, believe it or not, a computer scientist, not a pilot, but I had a very positive view of the Air Force, enjoyed being a part of that as a kid, being a military brat. So for me, it was really important to be a pilot. And I think, you know, the connection really for me is that it's a deeply operational job. You have to make decisions. You have to, you know, you live in an operational environment and that is somewhat unpredictable. And that's what I loved. Every day was different. As a pilot, what a fun job, right? And you know, I was outdoors a lot of the time. Sure, we all have paperwork and stuff like that, but it was just a really fantastic, exciting job, and gave me all those operational skills and, more importantly, the leadership skills that I could then transfer into space. And so I think, you know, I'm exceedingly grateful. And you know, as I have pointed out in other venues, it's extremely unlikely that a little girl who dreamed of going to space in 1969 could possibly have become a space shuttle commander in any other country. It's only in our country, and the military gave me that opportunity.
Okay, you're right, Pam. I really can't follow the astronaut.
Sorry.
Lesson learned for the next time. But you know what I would say, you know, so I mentioned earlier, I have a journalism degree, right? I mean, I kind of lucked into the space world, but I knew that I wanted to serve, and I think that was really it. You put your hand and swear to the Constitution, and there's this deep swelling of pride, and it shouldn't just be for military, civilians too, and then the government contractors that support them too, right? I mean, we do an incredible mission when you work for the United States government, and certainly in space that's so cutting edge, you won't find those opportunities elsewhere. I think, Pam, grateful is probably the best word that I can come up with, is that, you know, you're grateful for that opportunity to have learned those systems, to have been in charge of that technology, but then also to be in charge of people and learn the leadership lesson that you can carry on with you. And I think that that's something that's so important, you know, that as we look at reshaping a Space Force, you know, that people can come in and out, that people can leverage those things that they learn and take them off, you know, to whatever organization or industry they go to, whether it's space or not. And then they can bring those experiences back. You know, Pam talked about that, like a lateral entry kind of thing, where, you know, we can really capitalize on that opportunity, so it's not just all completely organically grown within the service.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate your time. I'll pass it back over to Dan now.
Well, again, John, Pam, Mary, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion and very timely perspective and all the information. We are greatly excited about the Space Force and the opportunities that are out there. AIAA looks forward to working with everyone, all of you, on making these possibilities a reality for all of our members and participants. For our attendees today, we'll be taking a short break before our next National Security Track session. Starting at 1 p.m., we'll hear from the Defense Innovation Unit and a distinguished panel of guests about cislunar logistics, motivations, markets, and users. So with that, I'll turn it over to Toby. And again, John, Pam, and Mary, thank you so much for your time and sharing all of this information today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. And just one last remark. I know that we had some questions that we didn't get to from the audience, and so I will be providing those to our panelists from today. And I can promise you that you'll be seeing more from both AIA and AIAA with some responses to those questions. So thanks so much. We'll see you again soon for our 1 p.m. session.